Hello again and welcome back. I am Jared Case, Curator of Film Exhibitions at the Dryden Theater and the George Eastman Museum. And I've got another streaming recommendation for you, three of them actually, that will be explained by my special guest. I've got another graduate of the L. Jeffrey Selznick School of Film Preservation with me, Josh Romphf, who works at the University of Rochester. Welcome, Josh.
Thanks for having me, Jared.
So you graduated in 2012. It's been almost a decade for you now. How's it been going?
It's been going good. I came here to do the Selznick School, and I never imagined that I would still be here 10 years later. But I got my position at the University of Rochester, and it's been a really interesting and rewarding job. And I'm still involved with the Selznick School. So yeah, it's been great. I couldn't even imagine how it would have turned out. So
we should explain that you came down to us from Canada, which is very, very germane to your choices this week. And you managed to stick around in Rochester for this last decade. What is your position at the University of Rochester?
So I'm a software developer for the River Campus libraries. And in particular, I'm in a department called the Digital Scholarship Department. So I do a lot of work developing software to help with faculty research projects. And so some of those things, involve moving images. Like one of the big projects I've been working on is a multimedia annotation tool called Mediate. And then I also do some work with a group called the Lazarus Project. And so that's led by Dr. Gregory Hayworth, and they do multispectral imaging of rare objects across the world, mostly manuscripts, but more 3D objects too. So I occasionally develop software for them as well and work on some interesting projects.
Now, the title itself doesn't seem to have a direct line from film preservation to what you're doing now, but once you start talking about spectral imaging, and I know that there are those technical aspects that we went into as part of the school, is that where that sort of led you, or was there experience that you had before you came to the Selznick School that was sort of enhanced there?
Yeah, so when I had initially gone to school, like to undergrad, I had started out with more of a focus on computer science and software development stuff. And then I really got into film, and our production classes at that time, it was a lot of 16 millimeter production still. So that got me really interested in film. And then I ended up sort of switching into that direction. And then, when I finished school, I was working for the university archives and also in technical services, doing a lot of telecine stuff. And that led me to the Selznick School. And what I really enjoyed about the Selznick School, and still enjoy, is that, there is a very kind of hard science aspect of it. Like the classes that we took with John Irwin, and with Ed Stratman and the guys from IPI. So that kind of aspect of it was really interesting to me. And, I wish that we had, the relationship with Kodak back then, like with, was it Eastman Preservation Services? Is that what you guys are still calling it? Like
Film Preservation Services.
Film Preservation Services. Yeah, we, that would have been awesome to be able to do all that color grading and scanning and stuff like that. But definitely the sort of the hard science, like imaging science aspect of it informs a lot of the work that I do. But also just like you learn how to look, how to look closely at things. And it's given me like a much better attention to detail, I think too. So for instance, like there's a project that I worked on with the Lazarus group, and we did a 3D reconstruction of the Hunt Lennox globe at the New York Public Library. And so they had done multispectral imaging of the globe, like very high resolution multispectral imaging. And then I worked to stitch those images together. And so there was a lot of like analysis of the individual images and, the colors of those images and how they represented the original object. And so, it really was a restoration project, just, in 3 dimensions instead of 2. So I think that that critical thinking, that attention to detail is definitely something that I apply to my work every day.
And you mentioned, we were talking before we started recording, you did do some 3D printing. Was that part of the output of that project?
Yeah, so we had done a very high resolution 3D print of the object. We actually got it printed over at the Med Center at Strong. There's a group there that prints like anatomy for surgical simulation. And so we had lent them one of our 3D scanners. And so, they printed the globe for us, because ultimately the New York Public Library wants to do some casts of it and sell it in their gift shop. So yeah, we've got like a really high resolution print of that. I'm trying to think of some of the other 3D printing that I've done over the years. And one of the neatest applications, I think, was we had the film department had a Steenbeck, and it was missing some parts, like a core adapter and a few other things. So we ended up 3D printing, like designing and 3D printing some replacement parts for the Steenbeck. So yeah, occasionally we can do some film preservation related things.
I think that project, the globe specifically, has some really interesting analogies to particularly the way that we're preserving with digital now, and that the original object is there and it's being read by digital scanners, but then the output is something that doesn't harm the original, but it does bring it back to that physical space so that people can enjoy it in much the same way that the original object was enjoyed.
Yep, absolutely. And I mean, it's one of these things too, where like that globe never comes out. It's in a glass case, and it's in the rare books department, and it comes out for the odd exhibit here and there, but it's so rare. And it's also so small. It's like the size of a softball. So like that's where digital technology really kind of enables access, because you can zoom right in. Like we built some software. We built like a 3D viewer program so that like researchers can annotate the globe, and you can kind of look at the interesting aspects of it and zoom right in, which you would never be able to do with the real object. I think the same thing, for digital preservation and streaming and access. I mean, you got to get it in the hands of people, and what good is having films in your collection if no one can watch them?
Exactly. Yeah. So from softballs to hockey pucks, you and I have a history where we could always usually talk about sports, particularly Canadian sports. And yep. The films that you're bringing to us today, there's 3 of them that work individually, but also as you watch them together, they do have sort of a certain curated message. So did you want to introduce us to those films? And I love the fact that you're pointing people to the NFB website and all the Canadian films that are available for free on that website.
Yeah, the NFB website is amazing, and the scans look great too. They're all, I mean, most of the content up there is HD streaming, so it's a treasure trove of films. But yeah, I picked these because I'm Canadian. I'm a walking stereotype, but I am a big hockey fan, and during the pandemic, I had kind of missed hockey a bit. And, I started thinking about it, and I remembered the Sheldon Cohen film, The Sweater, which is based on a book by a guy named Romphf, who's a Canadian author. And he talks about his, so it's a children's book. It's an illustrated picture book. And so, I'd say like any Canadian between the ages of 35 and 50 probably remembers this book, but it's about his childhood in rural Quebec, and just how much of an impact hockey had, and in particular the Montreal Canadiens had on life there. And so he he ends up getting a new hockey sweater, and all of his friends, they want to be like Maurice Richard, who was, one of the great Montreal Canadian players, one of the greatest hockey players of all time. And his mother ends up ordering him a Toronto Maple Leafs jersey, which is a big no-no in those parts. So it's just it's a funny story about how, the sort of role that hockey plays in national identity, but in particular, like your regional team, and how that plays into your identity. And it's just, the animation style is really nice. And I thought I'd check and see if it was on the NFB website, and it was. And so then that led me to the second film, which is called Such a Simple Game by Gilles, who's, he was making documentaries for the NFB in the 60s. And then he kind of went in more of an experimental direction, kind of influenced by Godard, like late 60s Godard. And those films are up there too on the site. And they're definitely worth checking out. But Such a Simple Game is really interesting because it's like, I don't know, it's almost an essay film on hockey, and the cinematography is just incredible. Like you don't see footage like that anymore. Just this beautiful 16 millimeter footage of the Canadians playing a bunch, and this is like a very legendary era of the Canadians as well, when they had won like several Stanley Cups, and you get to see some of these really legendary players just kind of philosophize on the game. And I think that's what I find really interesting about that film too, is just like they speak very deeply about the game, which you don't really see in modern interviews. And they're also chain smoking too, which is pretty hilarious. You don't think of too many elite athletes just smoking, drinking like that. But I don't know. It's a pretty fascinating film, and it also plays into that idea of hockey's role in national identity. And then there's the Brett Kashmir film, which I had actually seen when it came out back in 2007, and it's a really interesting essay film that explores the myths that are sort of propagated in propagated by the first two films. And it's a much more critical, sort of reflective essay on hockey violence, actually, and the sort of underlying, the underlying tendencies of polite Canadians. And it's just, there's a lot of, like, the editing is really good, his narration is really good, and it's a really interesting piece that I thought was a good sort of counterpoint to those first two films, just to see how things have evolved.
Yeah, and as I watch them, I think that order really is important to watch them in, because you're looking at the importance from an early age, not only of playing hockey and being a fan, but of your identity as a fan of a particular team, and how that's propagated through the younger years into the players who are actually on the ice. And as you say, they were very thoughtful about the game and the way that it works actually on the ice. And the sort of that initial feeling of toughness of these guys, as they were losing teeth or breaking bones, and you just sort of get back out there. But the third film, as you say, undercuts that. It really talks, if there's a deep dive if you're into sports, but I think it's an interesting look, because it talks about expansion of the NHL and how once you have more people on the ice, you have to admit less skilled players on the ice. So some of them take on the roles of enforcers or goons. So they're in the position of defense where they're stopping the goals, as opposed to on offense where they're feeding the puck to the people that can put it in the net. And the violence that sort of comes from that, and sort of the unchecked actions on the ice that sort of fed into this, and how that became its own sort of reason for people to go to the games was because there was violence in the games that appealed to some people. It almost made me think of the film noir, The Setup, where you have these images of the people in the stands just like eating up this violence, instead of necessarily looking at hockey the way that the Canadiens during the late 1960s did. And it led into this thesis that most of the violent people that are on the ice are actually the Canadian players.
Yep. It's true. Sad but true. And I think there's been, since Brett Kashmir's film came out, there's been a bit of a reckoning, because of, the research on post-concussion syndrome and all this stuff. And there's definitely a lot less violence in the game, and it's getting back to the sort of, the simple game that Gilles presents. This really, like, I mean, it's almost, I don't know, it's really like, just watching that film in particular, and the footage, I mean, it's really operatic almost. And I mean, it's a simple game, but it's like, I don't know, especially you'll see towards the end of the film, there's a bunch of aerial shots and of how the players are laid out and their different, strategies and stuff like that. And it's really, it's a much more intelligent game than I think people, admit or want to admit. But, there's definitely a lot of thought that goes into winning those games. Especially when you don't have to worry about, the violent aspect of it.
Well, if we can go even further than the films, there's different size ice too, right? There's the international size where people have a little more freedom to skate and to use their skills, whereas the NHL ice is much skinnier. There's not as much room side to side, so that these people are put into a space where they're going to hit each other a lot more.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, absolutely. And so, like, I don't know, a lot of people prefer to watch international play, like, the Olympics, the World Cup, stuff like that, because it is much more about skill, as opposed to just pure brute force. So yeah, that's definitely a contributing factor. And that's why, like, it's definitely, the violence is not nearly as prevalent in European leagues as it is here. And there are a lot of other interesting films too that deal with this. Like there's Goon with Sean William Scott, the Canadian film, that's actually, it's funny and it's poignant. It's actually, really good. And there's another one that came out recently, which I haven't seen. I believe it's called Hello Destroyer, but it's about a player that, severely injures an opponent, and sort of the deep, like, guilt and regret that he feels about his actions. So I mean, it's nice to see that people are that filmmakers are interrogating the sort of the root cause of this violence, and not necessarily praising it, like they did in, say, Slapshot or something, the iconic film from the 70s, which, I mean, don't get me wrong, I like that too. It's good to be reflective.
Yeah, I'm when I'm looking at films and people are talking about films, we talk about extra-textual things such as, what the filmmaker intended, and I'm much less interested in that than I am in the extra-textual of what people bring to the films themselves. And these are films that you recommended, so I wanted to talk a little bit about your experience with growing up with hockey. And as you say, this was a children's book. You were growing up. What was your experience that led you to your love of hockey and exploring it through film?
Sure. So I grew up in London, Ontario, which is kind of equidistant between Detroit and Toronto. And so I grew up in kind of arguably the golden era of hockey, like the same era that Brett Kashmir kind of grew up in. And so, you kind of had to pick like being in that location, you had to pick either Toronto or Detroit. And I kind of leaned more towards Detroit because my uncle is like a huge Detroit fan. And, you know, my favorite player was the captain of the Detroit Red Wings growing up. And so I just remember reading the Sweater in school when I was a kid. And then I'm pretty sure we watched the film too on 16 millimeter. So, you know, I definitely miss those days, the classroom films. The teacher would roll out the projector and, you know, put on the 16 millimeter print that the school had from the NFB. That was commonplace for Canadian kids. And, you know, that got me into the AV club as well. But yeah, I think, you know, I saw Slapshot too when I was younger, and that also got me, you know, interested in hockey films. And then as time went on, I was less and less interested in kind of narrative cinema and more interested in documentary and essay film and more experimental stuff. And I didn't think like that you would ever see, you know, experimental sports films or essay films on sports. But actually, like someone like Brett Kashmir does it so well. And he has a newer film, feature length called From Deep, and that's on basketball, which is also great. But yeah, I think like I just never realized that the two would necessarily come together, like experimental essay films and sports. And so I find that really interesting. And like I was saying before, I mean, it's good to be reflective about these things and kind of, you know, figure out why we like them or why sports appeal to us and our, you know, it says a lot about human nature too, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful insight that, you know, often artists are charged with sort of making the art that they want to see, right? So making the film that you want to see, and the fact that you and Kashmir both are sort of the intersection of this fandom as well as that type of cinema that you fit together, and that there was an audience out there for what he was making, and just happened to be you.
Yeah. Yeah, it's such a great film. I'm glad he put it up on his Vimeo channel. I recommend checking out all his other stuff too.
So did you experience the same sort of things that Kashmir did as you were growing older and you saw more of this type of action in hockey? Did you make that connection between Canadian players and the violence?
Absolutely. I mean, I played competitively, I think up until I was maybe 18. And I just decided that it wasn't really for me anymore because I wanted to focus on school. And yeah, I didn't feel like going out and getting my teeth knocked out or something. Like, I mean, I still like, I would like to keep playing. I mean, I played a little bit here in Rochester, a little bit of pickup hockey at Paul Lewis Arena, but I mean, that kind of stuff, I've always found it to be a really fun game, but I never liked the sort of the really aggressive nature of it. So, you know, coming back to it now that I'm older and, you know, everybody's got to work in the morning. Nobody wants to show up with a broken nose or anything. So I think everybody mellows out when they get to a certain age, and then you can enjoy the game for, you know, the more cerebral aspects or the fun aspects of it. But yeah, I definitely had that same kind of, you know, that same kind of realization. And it's also like the culture is just still really backwards. You know, there's a lot of racism, a lot of homophobia in hockey, and they just kind of try to sweep it under the rug. And there's been a lot of stuff that comes out in the news lately. And I think I just keep saying that there's kind of a reckoning, but you know, we need to talk about these things. We need to address these things, and film is one way of doing that. Definitely.
Well, that is, I think, a perfect way to wrap that up. You did send me those links, and I will have those links in the body of the notes here on the YouTube video, so you can follow those directly. Two of them are at the NFB website, and we encourage you to check out all the other Canadian films on there. And the last one is on the Vimeo site. So all three links will be there. But before I let you go, I did want to ask you a few questions that I've been asking everyone with it being close to a year now since the last time that even most cinephiles have been to the theater. We're sort of missing that cinematic experience. So I wanted to probe your history a little bit more about you going to the movies.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Josh, what is your first cinematic memory?
Oh man. Yeah, that's a tough one. I'm trying to think. Geez, I'm trying to think of the first movie that I saw in the theater. And I'm blanking on it. I mean, it had to have been like maybe one of the Star Wars movies, or like Home Alone, or some kids movie from the 80s. I can't necessarily remember what it was. But I more remember the feeling, because like the theater that I used to go to, there was so it was in a mall in downtown London, and they had it was like the first multiplex in the city, which is in a mall that's of course now abandoned, or it's turned into like business space or something like that. But I just remember like the sort of garish colors of the of the 80s, early 90s multiplex, and just the smell of the popcorn and the sticky floors and the somewhat uncomfortable chairs. But yeah, I can't pinpoint the first film that I saw in the theater, but I definitely remember the experience of going. And it was always like really special to go, because we didn't, like, our family didn't go to the movies very often. We'd probably only go maybe like a few times a year. So I mean, I would watch a lot. I would go to the video store a lot more, because there was a video store around the corner. So I would just rent a lot of tapes.
Well, you're anticipating some of the other questions I'm going to ask. So the second question normally is, did you have a neighborhood theater or a theater that you went to on a regular basis? But you seem to have covered that a bit. And you also touched on the third question, which is, what is your favorite sensory experience about going to the theater?
Wow. Yeah. So I guess I just anticipated all of this stuff. I mean, I think now sort of from an older, like a more recent, more mature perspective, I think like the thing that I most enjoy about the theatrical experience is just, I mean, I like to be in front of a really big screen, it just feels like it's engulfing you. And there's nothing, I mean, DCPs look great, but there's nothing that compares to seeing like a beautiful film print 16 millimeter or 35 millimeter, and just that sort of warmth of it. And I worked as a projectionist for a while, so I look and I like to see the cue marks on the prints, and that sort of thing. Like it's I don't know, that experience just can't be replicated.
Yeah, I think you've already hinted at the answer to question number 4 as well. But where do you sit when you go to the movies?
So yeah, I like to sit, in particular at the Dryden. I like to sit on the ground floor, usually like right in the middle. I know, like when we took classes with Daryl Jones, he sort of told us what the ideal position would be in the theater, and I took that to heart. I don't like being too close, because I like to be able to, I don't really want to crane my neck or anything, but I don't like to be too far either, because I'm nearsighted and things get pretty blurry from back there. So I like to sit kind of, right around the middle is the sweet spot for me.
And one more that's not as cinema related. Is there a book that you've read that you would recommend that people pick up while they're at home, either about cinema, history, hockey, about your job, anything that somebody might read?
That's a good question. So I'm ashamed to admit that I haven't been doing a ton of reading lately. Uh, I mostly read like programming manuals and occasionally woodworking books and stuff like that. But I mean, I think probably one of the most interesting books, especially film related books that I keep coming back to. And again, it's also sort of a manual, but there's a book called Independent Filmmaking by a guy named Lenny Lipton, who was I think he was a filmmaker out in San Francisco in like the 60s and 70s. And I mean, the book has been out of print for a long time, but it's a really interesting, like it's got a lot of interesting filmmaking techniques, but it's from a perspective of, a sort of free spirit experimental filmmaker. And I mean, it's not necessarily light reading, but I like to just crack that book every once in a while. And I don't know, it's just a really interesting book.
That sounds great. That's certainly one that we haven't had recommended yet. So if you can find it at one of your used bookstores, that would be one to pick up.
It's a big yellow book with red font.
easy to spot. Josh Romphf, it has been wonderful catching up with you. Thank you so much for taking some time to tell us about your history and your recommendations. Again, those are going to be down in the body of the text here in the YouTube video. It's wonderful to see you, and we hope that everything goes well over at University of Rochester, and we can see each other in person again sometime soon.
Yep. Thanks again for having me, Jared. It's been great.